Chapter 15. Jonathan Thurston Powell Sr., being a banker, was a pragmatic man. The seemingly anonymous letter with the accompanying copy of some very damning recorded evidence that he'd received from the mayor were no less than tantamount to blackmail. He was furious at the mayor's impudence, and even more so with Johnny for being so careless and irresponsible. The boy had gone too far this time. My God, drug trafficking, proxenetism, and possibly manslaughter. There was no hope for that boy. Something had to be done, and something had to be done quickly, before his idiot progeny completely besmirched a reputation that had taken him a lifetime to build. Could it be that he was considering the unthinkable? Yes, it was. And after having given the situation careful, cold-blooded consideration for a full 5 minutes, he made the call. Special K was holed up in the family summer home in northern Maine. He was scared shitless, strangely exhilarated, and totally remorseless. He laid 10 fat lines on the glass coffee table in the den and just stared at them. He didn't even feel like doing them, but he did them all systematically, one after the other, within an hour. His heart had started to pound, and his mind started to wander like it always did when he went over the limit. No sweat. He could handle it. What the fuck? Who gives a fuck? Where the fuck was Laura? She wasn't taking his calls, the ungrateful bitch. He had no intention of taking the heat alone if it came to that. He'd spill the beans all right if it came to that. Fucking bitch. He'd show her. He'd show 'em all. He wasn't going to sweat it now. He had it all under control. It was then that he remembered that he'd set up the buy for the next day. Holy shit, he'd have to drive all night to get there on time. Good thing he had the money with him. He grabbed the keys, a bottle of Cuervo, and headed for the door, stuffing a couple of 8-balls in his shirt pocket. As he pulled out onto the main road, a nondescript black sedan pulled out behind him. His amped-up, drug-addled condition had prevented him from taking notice, and subsequently of the fact that they had been tailing him for quite some time at a distance of 100 yards. He was too busy fucking with the CD player and scattering his brainwaves to the four winds. Seriously bugging Jack, with all the attention span of a ferret on crystal meth. Marcel's office was near La Madeleine, only a 30-minute walk from the hotel, it being a pleasant blue-sky morning, a relatively rare occurrence in landlocked Lutetia. Towards the Seine I stalwartly strode, with a myriad of memories firing up at every corner. Then west along the river and north through the Place de la Concorde to arrive 5 minutes early. Punctuality being one of my strong suits, you dig? Marcel bore an uncanny resemblance to a mustachioed Steve Martin as Inspector Clouseau in The Pink Panther. Without the silliness, mind you, but it was a little disconcerting nonetheless. His mannerisms were by and large quite prepossessing. The only thing missing was a beret. At any rate, it was better to resemble Steve Martin than Peter Sellers. My French is fluent, and my accent is just about as good as an American can manage. He was suitably impressed, but switched to perfect Canadian English after our initial conversation. I filled him in on the mayor's apartment being under surveillance. How deep the mayor's influence went into the Parisian underbelly was my principal concern. So, Mr. West, we are of the same profession, you and I. You might say that you're my Western counterpart. A detail, perhaps, but not without significance. I trust that you plan to keep a low profile while in our country, because I am in the habit of uncovering scandal, not associating with it, he said, looking me in the eye sternly. It was my turn to be impressed. He'd done his homework, and was as serious as cancer. I could definitely work with this dude. I told him that the mayor's daughter was in my charge, and on the run without going into details, assuring him that at this point the situation was of concern to the American police and possibly the FBI, but that it would be of no concern whatsoever to Interpol or the French police. He wasn't completely reassured, but accepted the assignment. His fees were exorbitant, and the per diem was absurd, but I paid for a week of his time, cash in advance. He cordially wished me a pleasant day, adding that he'd call me if and when something came up. But you don't know where I'm staying? Of course I do, Monsieur West, he replied a little too smugly. Well, in that case, Marcel, all the more reason not to call. I'll be in touch. I decided to change hotels immediately. We moved to a small, obscure hotel in the 13th arrondissement near the Place d'Italie, changing taxis 3 times en route. A man needs his privacy. The afternoon's culture-vulture activities began with the Orsay Impressionist Museum, where I learned that Sweet Pea really dug Van Gogh and Monet, followed by a pleasant Tuileries Gardens peregrination, which led us to the Louvre Museum. Laura wasn't very impressed with the Mona Lisa, which we could barely see anyway because of the endless herds of intrepid digital contraption-toting tourists that flocked there like flies to carrion. But she did seem to be particularly fascinated by the Da Vinci School's St. John the Baptist, one of my personal favorites as well. Maybe there was hope for her yet. We then strolled around Les Halles, which has definitively replaced the Latin Quarter as the agora of modern Paris. Young people, tourists, and halfway house scavengers comprise most of its human itinerants. We dined on falafel and sodas near the Rue des Rosiers. I sadly noted that the Sept Lézards Jazz Club was now closed and boarded up. It was getting late by the time we arrived at the hotel, and as per our custom, she was locked in her room for the night. Wow, she even thanked me for my help, giving me a peck on the cheek. Miracles can happen, and sometimes do. The business now at hand was to case the mayor's crib and the surrounding areas before morning. It was time to get serious. It was a cool summer evening, and the suit that I'd worn to conceal my shoulder holster was not an inconvenience. I walked at a deliberate pace, expeditiously covering all the streets and alleys within a 200-yard radius of the apartment, scanning for surveillance teams, unmarked vans, or anything out of the ordinary, which took the better part of 2 hours. The coast seemed to be clear, even though the scene wasn't clean. I entered the building cautiously and alert, taking the stairs, avoiding the elevator. Once inside, I began a meticulous search for any signs of uninvited visitors. The lights and the TV were still on, and everything seemed to be as I'd left them, but my sixth sense was nagging me relentlessly. First, I canvassed the place for bugs as I'd done the first time. They had been slick not placing any before my arrival and initial sweep. But within an hour, I found no fewer than 10 different high-tech bugging devices, which I left in place. No point in letting them know that I was onto them yet. They had in turn left my cameras in place or failed to notice them, which I doubted unless they were total putzes. I downloaded 2 days' worth of vid feed and decided to stay a while and take in a movie on the boob tube. Perhaps someone would pay me a nocturnal visit, and I'd be ready for him. The Canal Plus channel was showing Kevin Reynolds' Waterworld, starring Kevin Costner, a movie which had been universally canned by critics and public alike when it was released, but for some strange and inexplicable reason has become a fetish movie for me. Go figure. The movie had always been about the boat for me, not the acting, with the exception of Dennis Hopper, whose portrayal of evil incarnate was so over the top that it is a monument to surreal tongue-in-cheek. That being said, there's really no accounting for taste, as my moms used to say. After the movie, I called a taxi service. The cab arrived within 10 minutes. I rode to the Place Saint-Michel and walked to the Luxembourg Gardens, where I proceeded to take another taxi to within a few blocks of the hotel and continued on foot, watching my back. I watched in disbelief as the 2 bungling thugs in France Télécom uniforms nonchalantly placed the bugs around the apartment without even noticing that they were being filmed. They obviously had very little cloak and dagger experience. They most def weren't ex-spooks, that was for damn sure. Possibly low-level ex-military, or maybe just a couple of thoroughly incompetent second-string mafia goons. You just can't get good help anymore, Mr. Mayor. It's a crying shame. I isolated a few facial shots of the pernicious perpetrators of this uber-amateurish spy versus spy work for future reference and committed them to memory. Never underestimate the enemy, no matter how innocuous they may appear. Then a call to my newfound stewardess friend Nicole to see if we could hook up during her layover 2 days hence. And if things went well, we'd give them some audio feed that they wouldn't soon forget. It was a vain thought on my part, but it might just prove to be very entertaining. The next day, Laura requested a visit to the Eiffel Tower, which is a structure that few Parisians visit and is a must for tourists across the boards. Her waking interest in her surroundings after only a few days astounded me. The resilience of youth is uncanny and never ceases to amaze me. Yes, girlfriend was making progress, and it was a good thing. The view was spectacular. We then ambled east at a leisurely pace along the Seine and toward Notre Dame Cathedral and the Place Saint-Michel, taking in the sights along the way. It was a pleasant, chillaxing, convalescent afternoon. Cool school and copacetic, you dig? I'd called Nicole that morning, and we'd agreed to meet the very same evening. After another quiet day of generic tourism, I parked Sweet Pea in front of the boob tube with room service and told her I had some important business to attend to. We met in front of the Bastille Opera House. She looked spectacular. Rosetta brunette page boy hairdo, crimson lip gloss, in her skimpy summer dress complete with fishnet stockings, garters, and open-toe 4-inch heels. Garters were always a good sign. It looked like I had a ticket to ride. I took her to a little salsa club nearby where Azuquita was performing. After a couple of mojitos, I asked her if she wanted to dance. She accepted, and it was off to the races. I'm not a bad dancer when it comes to salsa, and she was very good. We were even attracting some attention, and the band was on. An old friend of mine, an excellent trombone player by the name of Mark Sims, was playing in the horn section. He's a very bright, funny cat, and we had a good time talking to him during the break. We were happy to see one another. Our friendship had already spanned more than a couple of decades. The mojitos were having their effect on Nicole, and she started coming on hot and heavy as soon as the music had started up again, rubbing her honey bun all up on me every time she had a chance, kneading my butt with her strong, graceful fingers and breathing steam down my neck. She was definitely getting a rise out of me. After a few more fun and frolic-filled songs, she asked me to take her to my place. We were barely in the door before she jumped me, panting, groping, lapping, and a-licking. I took her hard against the living room wall, her legs wrapped around my waist. She came 3 times in 15 minutes, chanting, "Baise-moi, baise-moi, baise-moi." I then bent her over the couch and took her from behind. The olive skin of the small of her back began to shimmer with perspiration as the heady aroma of her musk rose to my nostrils. I was transformed into a human pile driver. She was most receptive to my renewed enthusiasm and gratified me with yet another tumultuous and vociferous orgasm. I then took a break to give her a tongue lashing that she would not soon forget. She in turn ravenously engulfed my throbbing tumescence, frothing jowls of flame, and tantalizing tongue of flurry, mesmerizing me to the point of near syncope with her miraculous mandible mechanics and lingual virtuosity, gluttonously goading me on to a grand finale, finishing me off like fireworks between her perfect breasts. We were both dripping with sweat and breathing hot, husky and heavy, you dig? After the requisite quid pro quo post-coital cuddling and afterglow savoring, she said she had to get home because of an early flight the following day. I called a taxi and took her home before returning to the hotel. We vowed to see each other the following week. Wow, what a lady. Chapter 16. Special K only noticed that the same headlights had been behind him until a couple of hours and half a bottle of tequila later. As he was passing the Burlington, Vermont exits, it was 3 a.m. He just passed the last exit as the car behind him accelerated, threateningly high beams ablaze. Holy shit, this guy's fucking nuts, he thought as he pushed the pedal to the metal. His Audi was a fast car, and he was starting to pull away, doing over 100. 105, 110, 120, 130, 140 miles per hour. Shit, that was about all she's got. The steering wheel was starting to vibrate very noticeably. Or was it his hands that were trembling spasmodically? Why hadn't he taken the Jag? The pursuing vehicle was riding his ass at 20 yards, blinding him with its high beams. This was totally fucked up, he thought. Gotta keep it together, gotta keep it together. He kept muttering to himself. He thought about his seatbelt not being fastened. Fuck it won't help me if I hit something at this speed. The pursuing vehicle started dropping back. 50 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards, but he barely noticed, steadfastly maintaining his absurdly high speed, adrenaline and coke pumping his heart until it felt like it was going to pop out of his chest. He never even saw the 18-point buck that crashed through his windshield, killing him instantly. The car catapulted, barrel-rolled, skidded for an eighth of a mile, only losing momentum when it had been virtually reduced to a heap of scrap metal, burst into flames and exploded action movie style. The pursuing vehicle slowed down to examine the extent of the damage as it passed, then continued on at the speed limit, leaving a jumbled, flaming pile of animal and mineral detritus in its wake. It was 3:15 a.m., and the final chord for our bad boy. B-flat major 7 sharp 5 over A-flat major 7 sharp 5, you dig? JPT Sr. picked up the phone on the third ring, and a voice said, "It's done." "Thank God that's over with," the heartless old bastard mumbled as he rolled over and went back to sleep. When I placed a call to His Majesty the next day, he'd almost gleefully recounted Special K's demise the previous day, also alluding that the feds were more than a little annoyed with him for not letting them in on the cartel caper earlier. He wanted us back in the apple ASAP. I didn't think that was a good idea and told him so. Didn't trust him, never had. Why was Special K driving at such excessively high speeds in the middle of the fucking night? Something was fetid in Fishtown, as in the gefilte was way out of kilter, you dig? "Well, all right, West. You better know what you're doing." "You too, Buster," I thought, mulling over the sheer callousness of this poor excuse for a human being. I decided not to tell Laura a thing for the moment, and not to encourage any contact with Daddy because it might just push her back over the edge. It was 9:30 a.m., and I was meeting Du Sapin at 10 sharp. As the taxi wound and wove through traffic, I couldn't help but feel remorse for the hapless children of the rich and powerful. The dapper Du Sapin seemed to have been awaiting my arrival with impatience, which was more than likely a rare thing for him. His tentative smile upon greeting me turned into a subtle scowl once he'd taken in my dejected demeanor. "Is everything all right, Mr. West?" he asked quite humanely, the tone of his voice revealing genuine concern. "I've just received some disturbing news," going on to relate that my charge's boyfriend had died in a high-speed auto accident the day before. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said considerately, the twinkle in his eyes diminishing a couple of notches. "Don't be. He had it coming," I replied a little too coldly. Somewhat taken aback, he said that he had a lot of information that I'd find interesting. I could hardly believe my ears once he got going. Laura had been a cheerleader in high school and had run track in college, and she still had a relatively athletic physique even after over a year of concerted drug abuse. Her hair was plain Jane brown, and her nose was a tad too big for her face, but she had a nice body, and all in all she was an attractive young woman with intelligent eyes, even though she obviously didn't think so. Insecurity is always the enemy, and self-assurance is something that must be nurtured early on. It had been a week since we'd arrived in Paris. Her anxiety was beginning to wane, and her mind was beginning to clear. She wanted to talk to Johnny. She never wanted to see him again. She wanted to talk to Johnny. She never wanted to see him again. She hated her mom. She hated her dad. She hated her mom. She hated her dad. She was starting to like Nick. Who was this guy? Well, he obviously had been hired by Daddy, but he definitely wasn't part of Daddy's world. She'd been seeing shrinks since she was 12, and being a bright person, she saw it coming a mile away. Transference of affection, distant parent syndrome, vulnerable and very disturbed young woman seeking reassurance and emotional security she'd never really had. Blah, blah, blah. "Oh, give me a break," she said silently to her inner shrink. A moment later she heard someone messing around with her door. She knew it wasn't Nick because he always called first, and it wasn't the maids because the Do Not Disturb sign was on the door. The cocaine addiction-induced paranoia still rattling regularly around her brain kicked in hard, and she reacted quickly, turning out the lights, stuffing some pillows under her sheets to make it appear as if she was still sleeping, and bounded for the courtyard view mini balcony. Stealthily pulling the full-length curtains and windows quietly shut behind her, there was about 4 feet between her balcony and Nick's. She climbed onto the railing, crouched and sprang, making it easily. Good thing he'd left his window ajar. She climbed in and crawled under his bed. She distinctly heard the muffled sneezes of a silencer-fitted weapon. Petrified with fear, she froze into a near catatonic state, barely daring to take a breath. Returning to my room around 1:30 p.m., I found a terrified and trembling Sweet Pea under my bed. Teeth a-chatter and stuttering every other syllable, she told me what had happened. I checked her room. She was right. There were 3 small holes in her sheets and pillows. We were out of there within 10 minutes. It was time to call for reinforcements. No more Mr. Nice Guy. No more fucking around. Marcel had gone on to explain that the mayor's apartment had been previously owned by a certain Leonid Kuznevsky, a.k.a. the Bear, second in command of one of the 5 main Moscow crime syndicates and in charge of their affairs in New York. He was one of the top dogs in Brooklyn. He also told me that the apartment had been sold at a fraction of its value, and that the surveillance team was comprised of 2 Kuznevsky Paris-based goons, and provided me with their Interpol jackets. So His Unholiness was in cahoots with the Russian mob. Why didn't that surprise me? The slimy bastard was really revealing himself to be as dirty can be. You can't get any lower than putting out a contract on your own fucking kid. The Bear's influence was not as pervasive in Paris as it was in New York or Moscow, but it spelled trouble with a capital T. Marcel suggested that we leave Paris pronto unless we intended to go to war with some very dangerous individuals. I was way past pissed. If they were after Laura, they were after me too. That double-crossing son of a bitch was most deaf messing with the wrong cat. He had definitely underestimated me and the extent of my influences in certain circles. It wasn't for nothing that I was still alive after all these years in this business. It was time to get Sweet Pea out of Paris, but I was going to have to get Kuznevsky's boys off my back first. Marcel gave me a list of known Russian mob hangouts, and that was about all I could expect from him. No way I was going to go toe-to-toe with these Moscow mercs solo. After the hotel incident, I had no intention of letting Laura out of my sight again. We'd take our chances in tandem. Was going to have to explain a few things to her, which was most def a delicate matter, but he could wait. It was time to do the unexpected. It was time for the prey to become the predator. And it was time to call one of my oldest and best friends, or should I say fiends. Boris and I went way back, and we'd sworn a blood oath along with 2 other young men at the age of 15, which still held, and would continue to do so until death do us part. But I'll get to that later. In the nearly 30 intervening years since that fatal day, I'd never called in a favor, but now was the time. We headed to my old friend's Ali's lair in the projects north of Paris and relative security. Ali was a welterweight hashish middleman that I'd known since my college days at the Sorbonne and Les Beaux-Arts. He welcomed us, no questions asked. I set up the sat phone and called Boris. "Что случилось, Nikolaevich?" Boris queried gruffly upon hearing my voice, addressing me affectionately by my patronymic. I appraised him of my situation and of the fact that Kuznevsky was behind it all. "Что такое, блядь? What the fuck, Nick? I hate that son of bitch," Boris exclaimed, tangible anger rising steadily through his deep, dark voice. I told him we'd be in Moscow very soon and would give him the details ASAP. "Без проблем, дорогой," he replied and hung up. I then called a facilitator. We'd have our visas within 36 hours. Then called my buddy Steve at FBI NY headquarters and told him that he should start looking into Mr. Mayer's connections with Kuznevsky. At first he feigned surprise, but when I asked him to cut the shit, he told me off the record that there was already an ongoing investigation underway. He asked what my sources were and where I was. "Mum's the word, Steve. Relax, I'm not even in the country. Stay alert, keep a lid on it, and watch your back, my friend." 2 days later, we were on our way to Wassy Airport, 2 first-class Aeroflot tickets to Moscow in hand.